Welcome, everyone, to Practice Live. What is Practice Live? We have been story catching for a little bit over 2 years, which is kind of amazing, with people all over the world sharing their stories of experience, stories of what it means to practice, and how to be here more and more. The archive of all of the practice lives prior to today, literally today, the first time that we're just going direct to YouTube instead of recording something and processing it and then bringing it to the archive. So this feels like a milestone and a point of celebration. But all of the archive of the prior practice lives is in the Communitas membership. So if you'd like to check them out, you can join us in the community. Today, we are joined by my friend, Spencer Rank. He's a longtime friend. He's the husband of one of my dearest friends. He's become a dear friend, partially because of that. But also, he's been in a peer apprenticeship with me, studying the alchemy, spiritual alchemy, and ways of working out how to get to the gold of ourselves through doing deep shadow work. No big deal. He's a musician and a theater nerd. That's safe to say, right? Can I call you a theater nerd?
You may.
And a piano teacher, primarily of kids. And we have a lot of really potent, funny, deep, irreverent, but like mystically informed conversations. And I often wish that people could hear what we talk about and how we talk about it. So here we are, live, talking about it.
Yeah.
Spencer, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I would love for you to briefly let us in on what's important about you. Who are you?
Yeah, it's a good, okay, I'll answer that question. For me, this is exactly the same as it is when you and I talk. Normally, I don't have a perception of there being anybody else. So there's just a fantasy in my mind of other people to whom I'm addressing. Yeah, so I'm Spencer. I live in Bellingham. I've lived here since 2017, grew up in California.
That's in Washington, by the way, for anyone who's listening. Bellingham, Washington.
Pardon my assumption. Yeah, Northern Washington. Yeah, I teach piano for a living. I have my wife, Italia, who's watching, and our daughter, Ima, whose room I am in, because it's quiet. And I, teaching piano is the big practice for me. The fact that I've arrived at a place in my life where I'm able to teach piano lessons, mostly to kids, and to a handful of adults, is like this perplexing gift that I'm constantly like, is this real? Can you just do this? But it's working so far, and that's a really nice. It's like a very strong platform for me to practice the things that I do and want to practice. And it's motivating. Like there's an urgency to it because it's how I pay for my house and family and food, and so there's a lot there. I went to college mostly for theater. I didn't do music like in school, which is maybe why I wound up doing it, because sometimes going to school for a thing can sort of ruin that thing. And like I got really good at theater and also stopped enjoying it by like I went to graduate school for theater. But all of that applies to everything else. That's the thing about like theater and acting and all that movement work. It just applies to everything. Yeah, and then I got involved with Meg's program because of a lot of reasons. I have a long and storied history with practice that has at times been very painful in my life and very dysfunctional. I have not been good at it. Piano was like the one thing in my life that I would practice for whatever reason. And so it's not a huge surprise. It's the thing I wound up doing for a living. Yeah. And the difference between the piano and everything else in my life that I tried to do and didn't do is an interesting conversation that I don't know exactly the answer to. But yeah, so that led me to get, and Meg has this relationship with practice. And so we started having conversation. I'm gesturing this way because for me, that's where Meg's face is. We started having a monthly conversation about practice, just meeting and coaching. And because it's like, I'm 37, and in my 20s, man, I was just like severely dysfunctional in a way that was visible to nobody. Because on the surface, like, I had a pretty good job, I was pretty healthy, like, I did stuff, but like inside, I was just collapsing all the time, being like, I'm gonna do this practice, I'm gonna do that practice, because I think if I did that, I think if I did this for 20 minutes every day, then I would, like, it would give me energy, and I'd live a life that's better, and I'd be happier, and I'd be more fulfilled, and I'd be more manifest. So I'm gonna learn the banjo for 20 minutes a day. And then that would just become the focal point of this just like paralyzing anxiety, where I wouldn't do it, and then I'd judge myself, and like, and I would literally get to a point where I was just like laying on the floor, like unable to move, just so racked with anxiety that I would just have to let it go. And then there was relief. And at some point I realized that it was that relief was the only thing I was getting out of that process, which I spent like a majority of my time silently and individually in. And yeah. So I don't know, without dropping just into the total arc of my life story, I at some point had a mentor who helped me not do that anymore.
Heard.
And that was a step forward. And I wound up in a place where I sort of just started being like, okay, well, what I know that if I think something's going to be good for me and select it as a practice and assign myself that, it's very destructive for me. And we live in a world that's full of a lot of messages of like, you know, pardon the language, but conquer your inner bitch, is, you know, just pull up the Rock's Instagram page, and then that's all it is, you know. Be
the Rock, name dropping.
Yeah, be the hardest worker in the room, right? And I tried so hard to conquer my inner bitch and be the hardest worker in the room, and it was so damaging for me. It was like self-traumatizing, and it never worked. Like, I just would have killed myself, and so I had to stop doing that.
Wow. Can we let's take a pause for a second.
Please. Yeah.
So you just said so much potent stuff. Oh man. So something that's coming to me, this doesn't touch everything you just named, but paralyzed by practice. Some of us are paralyzed by practice. Yeah. Some of us are paralyzed without practice. Like, we remain stuck without having some focus. And I think this is, I'm arriving, it's my own process has been like, I was paralyzed without having focus. I was just sort of slothful and like, I'll just stick with that. Like, I was doing a lot, but I wasn't really being. And when I tapped into painting, because actually most of the people who are maybe listening to this at some point don't know this, but I've had a daily practice in some form since I was 17, but it was very much a period of messing around for 15 years before I found daily painting, which I'll make a whole video just on that because it's a thing. But part of what happened for me is I began to numb in daily painting. I like woke up because I found painting, and then I began to like fall asleep to myself because of daily painting, because I was making a painting every day. And that was fine, except it became the new norm. And I kind of actually needed to break it open and to move into more alchemy, nuance, and a little bit beyond the binary. You touched on something about that, like, if I do this, then that, which I feel like is one of the cruxes of the current Western context and late stage capitalism. It's like moving our callings through the machine, moving the things that we're called to through production, through performance, through how we can survive on it. You touched a little bit on this too. I also didn't study music because I knew if I studied it, it would just kill it. And it was like breathing to me. And I was like, why would I cut off my breathing?
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are things I feel like we can be companioned by in persistent action, but what is it that's actually motivating that? And I would like to hear your words on what motivated you to move into this conversation of practice, besides somebody like me, around, from being paralyzed by practice, moving it into a state of like where it can be generative and not just punishment or um, torture or
Yeah.
I'm gonna die. Yeah, can you share a little bit of the mechanics of what moved for you and how you've been working with that?
Yeah. Um, well, I had a I had a I had a mentor in California named Steve, and I owe a lot to Steve. He's like very directly influenced me making the life choices that caused me to meet Italia and then have the child who sleeps in this room. Um, so I owe him a lot. Um, and he he was an art teacher and he taught painting. And he had this program where he would teach you how to reproduce a masterpiece painting in 12 months. Like basically pick a masterpiece painting, put a in 1 inch by 1 inch grid over it, and then do a grid over here and copy that over. And he'd teach you the skills necessary to do that reproduction in 12 months. And that was his program. But it was explicitly like, this isn't really about the art. This skill building practice with this very specific measurable goal is a platform for life coaching. And specifically, his focus was helping you get what you want in the realms of relationship, physical health, and your career, which are like three of the main things. And so through the process of learning this skill and developing this practice, his theory was sort of that these other things you want, if you get clear about them and you say those things aloud, as you do this process, those things will organize themselves around that, and you can make progress on those fronts. And so I started, and I met him in a real serendipitous way, and I started doing that program with him. And by the end of 3 months, he forbid me to draw anymore because it was just like so. Just like I drew well for like 2 months. I did it and I was good at it, and then I just started collapsing, and I would just get so wrapped up in just all this minutia and self-involved like judgment and anxiety and should do this, don't want to do this. Like what it always comes down to is I would have these goals. I want to do it until the moment of doing it arrives. And in that moment, I don't want to. And what are you going to do about that?
I want to do it until the moment of doing it arrives, and then I don't wanna. That's one of the things I keep going.
And when that moment comes, if you don't just force yourself to do it anyway, then you're weak and lazy and blah blah blah, and just the voices, parents, teachers, the rock, just just being like, you basically, those voices, which then at some point just become internalized within me, saying, if you were better, you would do this. And if you can't force yourself in this moment to do what you said you were going to do, then it is a flaw in your character. It is a deficit of like morality and a lacking of your willpower, and it is evidence that you are less than. And I lived in that belief for a long ass time.
I feel like that's that I feel like so many of the conversations I have with practice, that's what I hear. I hear so much of what you just said of like the voices that have been internalized of being weak and lazy, that it's a flaw, that it's a deficit of morality, that you suck.
You suck.
And it's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about practice, because I feel like I'm not sure we actually move into, it's not just individually, it's like in the collective, if more of us actually move from inner life and allow that to be more real and to be seen and to be acted upon in the outer world, I feel like as we practice that, things actually change.
Mm.
And that it's usually a low and slow thing. Like, it's usually a low and slow thing, and it's messy and it's subtle and it has like little sniggly bits that make us have to move back and forth. Like, we have to touch the shadows, like where those voices exist and where we've
Yeah.
believed them. And I'm curious how you began to not believe them. How did you begin to not believe the voices of being lazy, of morally, of
Yeah.
sucking,
The voices of
of
sucking.
not, of like being a little bitch and
Yeah.
not conquering it?
I
Thanks,
honor
Rock.
my inner bitch now. We have a
Oh,
different
good.
name. We have a different
I
name for
I,
that
wel-
part of me
I
now.
welcome home my inner bitch.
That's right. Let's snuggle. So, well, this is a little bit of a digression, but I did get like a diagnosis of ADHD when I was like 31, and possibly the main and maybe only tangible benefit of getting like an official ADHD, which is something I kind of always knew. I was like, based on the way I operate and what I know of this, I'm pretty sure if I go to a professional person and take a test, they'll say, yeah, you are whatever these letters mean.
Official
That's what
diagnosis. Yeah.
yeah, a diagnosis. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So, but the real thing that was useful from that was it brings with it the suggestion that all of this stuff that I've been struggling with is not in fact a deficit of character. Like, it isn't a character flaw. Like, there is another explanation for these challenges that isn't you're a piece of shit.
Right. Yeah.
And that suggestion alone just gave me that diagnosis gave me permission to entertain that idea, and that was a shift. And I don't know if it did anything else for me, but that was a lot. um you know
That's significant if you spent years
and having
trying
not
to
really looked
conquer that.
and having not looked at it, having just I accepted that premise unconsciously, the premise
Mm,
that if I could not do these things in this way, that it reflected on me in this negative way. I accepted
mm.
that without question for the entirety of my young life. And it came along like an ADHD diagnosis was part of it. And part of it was like this mentor of mine, Steve, basically just being like, what I want, stop. Like, just stop. Like, don't draw, don't try to draw, don't try to do this, don't try to do this. Like, stop assigning yourself practices because it's hurting you. And look at what you're already doing, because there's things that you're doing. You work this job,
Yes. Look
you
at
live in
what
this
I'm
place.
highlighting that as a tenet of practice.
Yeah.
What is it that you're already doing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm interrupting you, but so many people come
Please.
to me because like I have like a, well, if I were to have a diagnosis, which I think I actually unofficially have from some tests that I had done when I was living with my stepmom and my dad when I was like 11, they just weren't diagnosing girls with it, but I'm autistic. Like, when I look at that, I'm like, oh yeah. And I definitely get like hyper focused on things and obsessed with them and let them consume my life. So I've just basically figured out how to relate to other people with my
Yeah.
obsession.
Mm-hmm.
But oh no, I forgot where I was going. I forgot what you just said that excited me.
What are you already doing?
What are you already doing? So a lot of people come to me and they're like, what do you think I should do? And I'm like, I think that you could ask yourself, what am I already doing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think practice for me is so not about doing something. And I
Yeah.
think this is really hard to relay because it it requires some action. It requires like something outside of ourselves or some feedback, some relationship with something, whether it's, for me, there's a relationship with the blank page that helps me visit myself. But my actual practice is to visit myself. It's not, it looks like painting. Painting has been the way that I have feedback to actually like see, I like what Steve said of like skill building with specific measurable goals or whatever. And I'm
Right.
like, for me, it's not even a measurable goal. It's like I have something outside of myself that's giving me some feedback so I can actually see what's
Yeah.
inside. And but it's not actually about doing something that's confusing. So how I tend to approach this is to ask to ask ourselves, what is a quality that I feel like I can commit to? And then what are some ways that tends to already express in my life? A
Mhm.
quality that I wanted to commit to is staying present to myself, and a most pleasurable but also activating expression of that for me is painting. So if you were to ask yourself, and maybe model this in front of other people right now, you're
Yeah.
welcome. If you were to ask yourself, like, what is a quality that underpins your desire to practice? What's something that is motivating you from within that isn't attached to action and therefore is not really criticizable by the inner shit council that wants to tear us down, or the outer council that says those things too?
That's an excellent question. It's a question I don't always have the answer to.
It might actually not have one answer, and it
Right.
may not have an answer, and you don't need to answer it right now, but I just also want to highlight it may not have one answer.
Yeah, it may not. And I think, like, so to relate this with teaching piano, it's interesting that now I do a thing where I effectively assign, I have like about, I think, 28 students to whom I assign practices every week. And sometimes they do them and sometimes they don't. And Meg and I have talked about this, that like when you have a student come in for a lesson who has practiced their stuff, they did all this for 15 minutes 4 times this week, that's a different type of piano lesson than when they come back and they didn't practice that. And there is a conventional wisdom, I think a lot of piano teachers, a lot of people in the world would say that the piano lesson where they did practice has more value than the piano lesson in which they didn't practice. And
Mm,
if your only priority is that this human person makes measurable progress on the piano, if that's the highest priority, then a lesson in which they did practice does have more value than a lesson. They will make more progress in this lesson than in this lesson. But that's not my highest priority.
mm,
Um, because for me, every time I've made that type of practice my highest priority, I started to implode. And I was never successful at it in that just like A, B, do this, do this, do this way. So if I like started being like, you're doing something wrong, it would be the height of hypocrisy for me to like come down on students for not practicing when I'm in this conversation. So I named my business The Joy of Piano because when I started teaching, I really didn't feel qualified to teach piano, but I needed a way to make money because Italia was pregnant. And what I knew, and Steve, he this was a conversation he guided me to this idea because I was still talking with him at that time more actively, and he asked me a lot of good questions. What are you already doing? And then at this particular junction, we were talking, and he said, "What could you teach? Because if you could teach something, you could charge money for that." Again, it's hard to understate the influence of this one man in my world, but uh, so I didn't really feel qualified to teach piano, but I've been working with kids my whole life in summer camps and this and that, and so I was like, I know I can hang with kids and show them a good time. I know that when I work with kids, a good time happens, and then I think if we sit at the piano, like I know enough to maybe like teach them something, but I know we can have a good time, and maybe that's more important than like making sure that they go like Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, classical, scales. The rigor, piano lessons is very rigorous. It's a bunch of Russians and just hardcore discipline. Chinese, like just like a lot of really intense discipline where children don't have a choice, and that's been the culture of piano lessons specifically, is to force kids to do it whether they care or not. And that's
whoa,
created trauma. That's created trauma for a lot of
that's
half of my. I'm going a little fast.
no, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm like, that sounds like most people in Western capitalism, in our current Western
Yeah.
context. Like,
Oh, I think
oh.
Yeah.
That
Piano
just like
lesson.
that actually like activated some like
Yeah.
grief in me of like,
Oh
oh,
yeah. It's
I
tragic
feel like, yeah. Thanks for
because
saying all of that.
piano lessons are like it's a known cultural thing. Piano lessons, maybe more than any other instrument. Like kids take piano lessons. There's this is a piano teacher. If there's like that's a thing in our society, and it is a thing that has, I think, until recently, um, been primarily a really strong reflection of that same Western capitalist, just like where it's about progress, it's about results, it's about showing that this kid can do this high level thing. For what reason? For like so they can get into so they can put it on a college application, or like for the social credit score of their parents. That's the big one. Their parents want to show their kids off and look good for other parents. Look what my kid can do. And I about like half my piano students, their parents were forced to take piano lessons when they were a kid, hated it, never played piano again, and regret that it was that way, and still hold resentment towards that, but see that there is value in this and then want something different for their kid. And I'm like, well, shoot, if you just would like me to like make this not suck, that's a pretty low bar. Like the piano's fun. Like it's not that for me, it's not that difficult to just like we could have fun at this instrument instead of making it about just like you got to be better every week, which is really lame, but it's the way it's been. And I think it's a reflection of the way society has been, and it's caused damage. Just and it's the piano's a microcosm. Like when I teach a piano lesson, I get to see a lot of what's going on in a student. I think there's something about music, probably in any type of art, it's a microcosm for just like all that's going on in a person, and our
Majorly.
society's relationship with that art is a microcosm for our society's relationship with itself more.
Oh my gosh. I listened to a podcast from a painting teacher that I'm studying from, and um, she has some hot takes on how art is treated. It's like it's like often treated like a wounded animal, like support for the arts.
Yeah.
But it's also like set to the elite. And I feel like either of those extremes, kind of like what you're talking on of like I want to show my kids off and how they have made progress and they have results and they're so morally cool because they can be disciplined.
Yeah.
um Superior.
Look how
um
compliant my kid is.
Look how compliant my kid is. Exactly.
Yeah.
um and I feel like the spectrum of like elitism or like poor, wounded animal is creating so much turmoil in this potential culture. I don't really think of our Western context as a culture. I think of it as a context right now, because I feel like you'd actually have to have art as the center for it to be a culture, and art is
Right.
like pushed out to the edges.
Mm.
But again, I feel like when we can make our inner lives more real, more visible, more seen, which we do through art, which isn't about good art. And
Yeah.
who judges what good art is anyway?
Yeah.
Um, Something that you're touching on that I would love to hear some of your perspective on. I was, in talking about what our conversation would be about, I touched on the trickster archetypal energy of like, um, there's something that you and I have begun to talk on in our session work. And maybe you don't have a lot of words on it yet, but like I'm curious about what you might say about the indirect method of teaching actually tricking people into uh moreness, because it's like ultimately some of your kids are definitely getting better at piano, like they're actually wanting to play piano and getting better at piano,
Yeah.
because it's not coming from the like authoritative like archetype of or whatever, like some other archetype that's like, dirt, dirt, dirt. You will
Mm-hmm.
do these things and have authority, and you're going to do them because you're motivated by pleasing me.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there's something about the trickster archetype that I've been sitting with, that I've been encountering, that the authority of the trickster is not human. So its means are not necessarily linear, and they're not necessarily productive for recognizable in what they produce for humans in human systems. But
Mm.
it's actually moving into a higher expression, into yeah, just like a more integrated, elevated, higher perspective. Um, so I'm curious, I don't know, I'm curious what you might say. Maybe you could give some story examples if it's not inappropriate of like some of the kids that you've been working with that actually have become better at piano
Yeah.
because of the indirect way that you're holding the space and encouraging them and modeling for them, not like hard punishment discipline, but actually like the pleasure that can come from discipline or like the joy. Yeah. There's a
Yeah.
couple stories that I'm thinking of that I would like, I mean, like maybe you'll touch on those, but yeah, the joy and whether it's the kids and or the parents too. I don't, if
Yeah.
again, I don't know if it's inappropriate to talk about your, about your clients,
No, I
but
can. No.
cool.
Um, yeah, and I can think I can. What comes up is that I can like your last question, which I didn't directly answer, but spun off from about the quality, like what quality have I come to court in practice, is related to this question. Because what the first thing I thought I didn't say was if there is a quality, it's that I can show up to in practice. Really, it's just turning, I guess it's turning my attention to how that process is going, to what's happening, just looking at like, well, do I have goals? What's my goal? Do I have one? If I do, am I doing that? Maybe a little, maybe not. If I'm not, what am I doing? Am I looking at this? Like just just turning my attention to that whole picture, that whole complex, and just being like, that's okay. Like just giving that permission to be the way that it is and not having to like avoid it, because I will habitually avoid, I just won't look at it. It's just look at it and give it permission. If I'm failing, if I'm succeeding, look at it, give it permission. Permission was really big for me. And that's fundamentally what it comes down to with students. Like I have one boy who, I actually have two. I got a bunch of students. I'll talk about one. I have one who started when he was almost 6 and now is, I think, almost 10. So he's been with me for 4 or 5 years. And when he started was just wild. Just like this is like an almost 6-year-old boy who like lived way out in the county and like rode dirt bikes with his dad. and just like the initial proposition of this boy sitting down at the piano with me for 30 minutes is preposterous out the gate. And yet he comes here because there's something about the keyboard that he was gravitating. He had a keyboard at home or a piano like in their barn that he was gravitating to. There's something there. And early on, if I tried to get him to sit down and focus on a thing, he would be like out the door, just like up the walls. And we used to talk about, and I put an image to it at one point. It was like, dude, it's like, I tried to spin it really positively because he couldn't focus at all when he was 6. And I was like, this seems normal. Like my 6-year-old can barely focus. I can barely focus. So like, I was like, it's like you have like a horse inside you that's just like a wild animal that wants to run. And he was like, it's like a lizard. I remember that he renamed it a lizard. Like, and for a while, we had this whole thing of like, I would ask him to do something, and then he would just have this lizard that would just explode out of him, and he'd just freak out and spaz a bit, and we'd be like, yeah, look at that lizard go. And then sometimes that would come back onto the keys, and he'd just play, and I would communicate it. Communicating with parents is a thing too, because parents have expectations, and I try, and usually they bring kids to me because I'm pretty open about the way I teach, and they're looking for something like that because they know I'm a teacher for kids who won't do it the more structured, conventional way. And just be like, because they'll be like, is he doing okay? Like, is he paying attention? I'm like, oh, dude, who cares? Like, he's here, he's enjoying it, he's having a good time, he's touching the piano, which I guess is the goal here, and we're like building something. Now he's almost 10, and like he's been doing piano lessons consistently. He's finally just this year starting to get good enough at sight reading to actually learn classical repertoire, like beginner, like late begin, just like, and he's doing it. And I'm just constantly amazed, just like, wow, you're just like actually getting good at the piano. He can improvise, he can sight read, and all of these things. I didn't force him to do any of it. I barely even suggested it. I mean, I did consistently give him the opportunity to do it over the course of 4 years. And then totally give everything about how that went permission to be that way. And God bless his mom for just letting him keep coming. And at some point, she did start encouraging him to practice at home in a way that worked. Specific to piano lessons, them having a functional conversation with their parents about practice at home can be big. Like, and it didn't work for a long time, and then they hit a stride where when she said practice, he would, at least a little, probably because at that point he kind of wanted to anyway.
Hold on, can we pause for a second?
Yeah.
Ooh, he wanted to anyway.
Yeah.
Again, I feel like this relates to like what are you already doing? I feel like another facet of that is what are you want? Like, what do you want? And not just like, what do you want to want, but what do you actually have desire birthing from you? You said something though that I also want to highlight as a mechanic of practice, of offering consistently offering the opportunity to like see the next things, like the next growth edges. Like, you didn't force him to do the classical repertoire, but through consistently having that available with permission, and encouragement, acceptance for like where somebody's support for, like moving through the wily lizard phase.
Yeah. Like, I'm excited
like
for anything sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
Letting the lizard actually exist and be witnessed, and of shamed, not, to have additional presences of that with parents or with other caregivers. Particularly when learning a skill, I feel like there's something just so loving and potent about that, of like witnessing where it's wily and offering consistent opportunity for the next growth edge.
And there's
just rad. I'm just celebrating. I'm just celebrating that.
Yeah. It is rad. It is radical in the sense that they're in what you step into with that, in that process, is the possibility that they won't. If they don't want to. If they don't want to, they won't. And you have to be okay with that.
Yeah, majorly. That's awesome, right?
And that might mean that eventually they quit.
Too. We might want to want something. So I feel like I'm talking a lot about, I ended up coming up with a framework around practice, like the first framework around practice, and I'm just that I'm referencing it, but like asking ourselves what we want, and then actually going through a process of availing ourselves to recognize if it's actually what we want, because a lot of things that we want are conditioned. It's so hard. It's actually like a practice to know what you actually want, what actually motivates you, and how to move with that. So like the first 15 years, I call that time lovingly the mess around, because I basically was like, I want to do yoga. No, I don't. Not like that. Like, I want to journal. Ugh, I actually hate journaling. Turns out, like, we might and or like, I feel like some of those desires companioned me for seasons, and then they pivoted. And I feel like another thing that our current context tries to do is to lock us into something for 30 years, retire from it. It's like we could like come out with our desires and then like make something cool that serves the system with it, and then do that for a lifetime and then retire. I'm like, maybe not. Maybe if there's a commitment to a quality underneath, or a desire that's underpinning, like for whatever reason this kid kept finding himself at the piano, and how can we be our wily lizard selves and the self that like continues to grow into the edges, and be companioned in that, be witnessed in that, which I feel like isn't going to happen by everyone all the time, because most of us are conditioned. So we're not going to necessarily see that. And so I just continue to celebrate that you are somebody that is really committed to that and seeing that and supporting that, because I had some people in my life as a young person where like, that's why I've arrived at the work that I'm doing and how I'm doing it, because they actually let me be who I was and let me grow into my edges without like discouraging me. And it took me a little bit longer, I guess, except I feel like with something like art, what I found is like, It might have taken me a little bit longer to technically get better, but my whole self actually was with myself in the process. And so
Mhm.
when I arrived at actually being somewhat good, I was
Yeah,
ready for that and with that.
yeah.
And I'm wondering if you maybe have your own experiences or stories of like kids around. You just actually shared a story of that, of like, it took like 4 years, but like he's, moving into a classical repertoire naturally.
Hmm. Yeah. I quit piano when I was a kid be- because everybody wanted me to practice and I didn't want to.
Yeah,
And there
totally.
was and there wasn't the idea wasn't present. The idea wasn't present. There it didn't exist. The idea that I could maybe not practice or in the way that they I have another student who like has been with me for the same amount of time, another young boy. And early on, his mom was just like, "Can they just have permission and not practice? Because they like coming to piano lessons, and that seems like a win. But me trying to get them to practice at home is making them say they want to quit." And so now,
I love
like,
that
it
you're
was
sharing this one. Thank you.
yeah, it was two brothers, and now the older one just is like he can do it now, so he doesn't come anymore. He can do it if he wants, but doesn't care as much. The younger one still comes, and now he's just like he found his thing eventually, and yeah, like uh and then Meg and I were talking about this. He got into it out of just like permission to not practice, and then he got like a year, 2 years ago, he got hooked on playing Carol of the Bells. Not at Christmas time, and got obsessed with playing that, and then taught himself how to play the like Linus and Lucy Peanuts song. Then it came like 6 or 8 months ago. His mom was like, we were talking. He's like, I sort of thought he might be able to sight read and learn some classical music by now. And I was like, yeah, I didn't think that, but she kind of wanted me to pressure him to learn how to sight read, and we spent about 3 months trying to do that. She was just like, "Can you just like he like listens to you and respects you? Can you just like try to like talk to him?" And I did, and I was as gentle as I could be while also creating a little bit of like, "This is what I want you to do. Like, are you gonna do what you said?" I tried to do the like, say what you're gonna do, then I expect you to do that. And you know what happened? He just stopped playing piano completely. After about 3 months, he just wasn't playing anymore. Then his mom called me and was like, "Spencer, I think we messed up." And in my head, I was like we almost got in a fight about it when she suggested it to me because I didn't think it was a good idea. And then she was like, "But I want him to try." And I was like, "Okay." And I think it was good because it's good to challenge the status quo. And we've been doing the same thing for a long time. That
Ooh,
particular challenge, he,
I'm just highlighting that.
yeah, yeah,
Just we'll come back to it.
yeah.
It's good to
He
challenge like
totally.
where we plateau at.
And because we were focusing on sight reading, he did get better at it, even though we only did it during lessons. So now we still do that because she was basically like, "Can we just backpedal, go back to?" And now we've got him. He's playing what he wants to play, and we just practice a little sight reading during lessons. And this is all very specific to piano lessons, kind of, but kind of not. One thing you said that because you said it earlier, there's a thread that's like some makes me think of some notes I took recently in after some of our sessions, which is there's a rock and a hard place that I find myself in, have found myself in, and I still don't know the answer to the equation, really, which is that like practice can be paralyzing. You said that earlier. Like for me, practice was paralyzing. For you, not practicing was paralyzing. For me, it's both. That's the reason I wanted to practice so hard. Not practicing anything made me feel stagnant and complacent and effectively paralyzed. And the sort of point in my process that brought me into conversation with you was that after I stopped, my other mentor Steve was just like, stop trying to force yourself to do this stuff. Look at what you're already doing. You know that's those are things that you want to do because you're doing them. And if there's all these other things you think you want to do but you're not doing them, you don't really want to, and that's okay. And I lived in that, and that was a big step forward for me. It was much healthier to I just stopped assigning myself stuff, and it was better. And then there were things that I would do, and it's after a few years I started to see like, well, this is better, but it's still a bit, I don't have a lot of agency. Like I'm not forcing myself to do stuff, but I'm not forcing myself to do anything other than the things that like are really urgent, like paying the bills. And you know, so the conversation with Meg came out of how can I have more agency in this, and something so a phrase that stuck with me that came up early in our conversation was right-sized self-coercion, because I basically lived on this spectrum between abusive self-coercion that was really destructive and complacency. Abusive action towards myself or no action, and neither of those places are balanced. And a place of no action was an improvement over like abusive action toward myself. And I found myself asking the question, how do I find a middle ground? How do I find somewhere between complacency and abusive self-coercion? And after a while of having that conversation, I was like, I'm not sure if there's a point between complacency and abusive self-coercion that is healthy. um, so how can and Meg brought the word stance. How can we find a different stance than this paradigm? Because if we're on this spectrum from I'm hurting myself to I'm just a sloth, like there's nowhere between those 2 points that's balanced for me. So how do I find a third dimension, a different stance to be in? And some part of that stance is looking at the way that that functions for me, where I can hurt myself with practice and I can hurt myself with inaction, and I don't know how to control that. And then I just go here and I look at that whole thing and I go, that's okay. And here's the thing, like maybe I don't do anything, because there's still this voice that's like, oh, this whole conversation you're having, all these fancy words and this process is all a clever way to get yourself to do the thing so that the boss man can make more money. And like, and it's that end gaining of the result of doing. And anytime I step into that my goal is ultimately like, and that's why it's radical. It is radical. If I have a student come in and I offer them this permission, it's kids are always, that's what kids want, because their parents and their teachers are telling them to do stuff all day. Me and Natalia are actively in this conversation about like, how do we get our daughter to school in the morning without just bossing her around constantly? Give her chocolate. That's our current strategy. But like it, I really try to make piano lessons one place in these kids' life where the adult in the room isn't trying to force them to be a way that's different than what they're bringing to the table. And what's radical about that is, and that's all.
Ooh, just highlighting that. Just highlighting that one. I feel like, oh man, I wish we had another hour because we only have 10 minutes. How can practice not be the thing in which we are trying to make ourselves different than who we are? Yeah. And that's a thing to sit with. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why it's so about inner life alchemy for me, and why there's like a bunch of escape hatches. Because if I end like making it about doing something, it is the thing that you said earlier, like just a moment ago, of like, it's a clever way to basically trick ourselves into like productivity or something. And yet, like, to actually participate and truly be of service in the, we do need to do things. We do. And how can we do things in a way that's informed by who and how we are? And it's a bit of a dance. But I'm so grateful you brought in right-sized self-coercion, because I feel like after that conversation, I began writing. And if you want to know more about this, it will definitely be in my next book. But I'd actually love to have like a follow-up conversation with Spencer about this, like in a few months, because the right-sized self-coercion, like I feel like we can't do nothing, and we also can't be abusive to ourselves, like what Spencer's saying. So go, you go.
Well, there are some distinctions to be made where, like in a piano lesson, if you don't practice the piano, and there's no negative consequences to that in your life. Like that's a space where you can be like, I can give full permission. And I mean, and the worst case scenario is that they don't play the piano, and like they won't if they don't want to, and if they don't want to, they shouldn't. There are perhaps other realms where like there's more urgency behind, like, you actually do need to do this to like care for yourself or to care for others. And for me, the higher those stakes are, actually the easier the equation gets. Like for me, teaching piano is this really powerful practice in my life that I do regularly all the time. Why? Because if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to feed my family or we wouldn't be
Exactly.
able to
So,
afford a place to live.
oh
The
God.
stakes are high enough.
Okay, two things. Ooh! I feel so squeezy.
I know.
Um, so I feel like in a way, art is high stakes. But it's because the inner world comes out to play. Like the shadows come out to play, and it's all like, I feel like I'm gonna die if I make a mistake doing this thing. And so I'm either going to like push into it or I'm gonna push away from it and avoid it,
Yeah.
or I'm gonna find some sweet spot. Um, and therefore it makes something like creativity essential to me, not in part because I actually do really think it's like the thing. Is why I think it's the most valuable thing is that it brings us into contact with how we're actually showing up in those other high stakes things. Like, I think so. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and we literally have like 8 minutes, and I would love to open the
Yeah.
floor to somebody maybe to ask a question, but something I've been sitting with, and we may not be able to really get into this, is like, what is it that actually makes a practice, right? Because it's not just showing up
Yeah.
to do the thing. Something that I've been talking about with somebody in my practice about practice, practice. It's like my favorite word. Is like there's doing this module in Soul Friend. There's like getting into the practice and being in the practice and then coming out of the practice. That's part of practice for me.
Yeah.
But it's also like a quality of presence that is tuned to something. Like I feel like that's a curiosity that I have, and why I'm, interested in companionship conversations around this, because I'm like, what is it for other people? Like, what is
Yeah.
it that like you're actually with? Because if it's a matter of, I feel like there's in a way two camps of practice. There's the, and I think you and I talked about this. There's the like achievement practices of like, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to play a piano so I can get into Carnegie Hall and I can play a piano in front of people and get accolades and maybe money.
And for
So I'm going to like do it,
some
which
people,
is
that's the
great.
right path. Yeah.
And that's great. It's not instead of that. And I know I just made a little Pee-wee voice about it, but it's like not, it's, that's not bad at all. Like, I feel like there are things in all of our lives that benefit from achievement practices. And
Yeah.
then I feel like in addition to that, there are alchemy practices of like, who are we being and who are we being? And how do we like stay present to that and unfurl in that? But I'm curious for you, before we open the floor, if you could briefly touch in on what is it that makes practice for you?
Um, well, practice is something, I mean, this is a good question. Um, my sort of boring definition of practice is just it's something that you do on a regular basis, right? But the whole conversation comes down to controlling that. How much agency do you have? How much control do I have over what I do on a regular basis? And I often don't feel like I have a lot. I feel like on some level I've accepted that like the trickster, this trickster archetype thing has come up recently in our conversations. And what you were talking about made me think. In theater school, we did it. I went to this physical theater school called Del Arte in Humboldt, Northern California. And we did a unit on clown. And it was really powerful because clown is this embodiment of of a trickster archetype. And the clown can be very powerful. I remember this exercise that we did where there were basically two like staircases, like here and here, and in between there was a gap. And as like a group of like 4 or 5 people in clown, we had to move across this gap. And in between these two platforms was the void. The void doesn't exist. You can't be in the void. And so at one point, we were trying to go across this thing where these platforms are just far enough that it's hard to do, but you can do it. And you have to try to organically, as a group with momentum, be moved by the, I don't know, clown space energy across that in embodiment, not doing it cleverly. And I remember at one point we were trying, and I lost my balance. I was trying to carry this girl on my shoulders, and I dropped down into the void. And when I landed there, because we couldn't get across and I fell, what I did was start yelling like, oh, like, and then we all started pretending like we were falling into the void. And the teacher was like, stop, like, not good, like you can't do that, like you're doing a clever thing in the void, like you can't be in the void, you can't be in the void like pretending you're falling into the void, because it's the void, it doesn't exist, you can't be in there. And then he's like, but here's the thing, the clown, because what happened was we fell into that space and then did a clever thing from our brains to try to cover. And his point was that like the clown in an organic movement of total presence can find themselves in the void in an impossible place and then find themselves out of that space again. But you can't do it with your clever brain. Like you can only do it by total presence and embodiment, which is a really high bar to cross, like in the theater space. But this idea relates to this for me, is that when I find successful practices in my life, usually suddenly I notice that I'm doing it. Like I just happened to be present with a flow in my life, and then at some point I'm like, oh shit, I'm like doing the thing that I've spent my whole goddamn life just agonizing over, and I didn't even notice because I was so present with it that I didn't, it wasn't. And how do you control that miracle? I don't know.
Ooh, oh my God, so present. I feel like that you talked about with like okay, so for me the container is painting. The container is painting. But like, am I in my practice like every second that I'm painting? No. The container is the consistent opportunity that you were talking about with
Yeah.
it's like, okay, you showed up. Okay, cool. You showed up, and now like what's the thing that's going to focus you enough to like be in a space and a threshold of recognition? Okay, cool. Check, check. Like that took me like 15 years to find, like, how do I, what am I going to show up to? I'm going to show up to painting. Is this a thing that's going to hold my attention long enough for me to enter into a threshold of recognition of who I am and what's happening? Okay, cool. And what I find is that it's not like I'm like completely present to myself or even like thinking about inner life stuff while painting. Something about that space and that quality of activity and what it does to me, it's like actually activating. Like paint is deeply activating for me. Color is activating, like the viscosity of it like makes me go, ooh, like I feel squeezy in it. And so I'm like kind of in an interesting state when I'm painting. And I spontaneously often, like nearly every time, find myself in the thing, in the void. And it did require me getting past where I'm clever. Like it totally got me. I had to move past what I wanted to want. I moved past what I didn't think I could do or what I should do or what other people wanted me to do. Oh my gosh. Like I had to move through the clever. I had to move through thinking.
Yeah. Can I
And
respond
move
to that
into
before we
definitely.
just, yeah, because I might, like, if I have a, since we're about to switch gears, if I have a conclusion, it's this question I have of, because what we're opening space for in this conversation is for you to do what you actually want, not the clever ideas you have about what you think you want. Because if you open an authentic space, the things you don't want will not happen, and the things you do want may happen. And I guess we spend a lot of energy, we're very encouraged, I think, to try to control what we want. And this is a question I have: can we actually control what we genuinely want? And if we do have that power, should we control it? Like, because a lot of that control is like a coercion that I feel is related to like slavery still, like the ethos of slavery in that persists in our culture, being like, you should change what you fundamentally want, which is to say you should change who you are to be in accordance with a separate ideal, or something. And the risk in opening the space in lessons with a kid that is truly that type of space is that if they don't want to play the piano, they won't. And sometimes their parents really want them to, but they don't, if they're bringing them to me, they don't get to be the master. The parents don't, the kid does. And
Oh my goodness.
you know,
I want to highlight, can we control what we genuinely want? And if we can, should we? Because this touches on the ethos of slavery. 100%. And we're just
yeah.
going to mic drop right there. Because there's so much more. There's so much more we could say on that. And it's again, deep and motivated to talk about practice, because it's this courtship of actually going in a generative direction of liberation. I feel like through practice, I unfold into more liberation. It's not like practice freed me. Practice frees me as I keep dropping into it, and as I refine my attention more in the direction of liberation. And that changes how I practice. You know, for 8 years, I made a painting every day, and that wasn't even my agreement. I just like did it because it's like what I could. It's like how it expressed. And now it's so different. And in fact, the qualities that are underpinning it have changed because I've changed. I feel like practice isn't static. It's not some like, yeah, it's not static.
Yeah. I'm not going to respond to that, because otherwise we'll just keep going.
We have fodder for you to come back and talk more.
Yeah.
I am curious if anyone here has any questions, and if you are in the room and and there's some folks who are here in the StreamYard room. If you do have a question, can you come on the chat and indicate that you would like to come on, and if you would like to come on camera, and we'll give a breath or two for some space for that. In the meantime, I will just say, damn.
Feel your
while
feet.
We're opening the,
Feel your feet is what I said.
I invite you to feel your feet. That's me making fun of myself. Actually, it's Spencer making fun of me, which is perfect. Something I also wanted to throw in there, since we're like throwing things in, waiting if there are any questions in the room. One of the things that I love about practice is that it takes pressure off of the muse. I feel like so many of us in this agency piece, rad. So many of us in this agency piece lose our agency in waiting for the muse, like waiting for inspiration. And I feel like practice is a piece of stepping into declaration, and therefore giving consistent permission, giving consistent opportunity for something to happen. I'm going to bring Chena on. There's no question, there's just appreciation, but I would love to have them speak this in their own words.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, everything you said has been part of my story my entire life. Yeah. And hearing another human speak that, I didn't think I was going to get emotional saying this. That feels like permission for it to be okay for me to have struggled with this for so long. I also have autism and ADHD, which is quite a thing to struggle with in one brain. And I spent a really, really long time struggling with like, do I want to do this, or do I just want to do this? I, went to multiple art schools trying to figure things out and then quit and blah, blah. And I am still right now in the process of figuring out like, which of the things that I say I want are the things I actually want. Am I procrastinating on something just because I'm not good at it yet? And I know part of it's that, or is it just that like, I thought I was supposed to be this thing and I actually just want to do this. So yeah, I'm so grateful for everything you said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's so rad. Yeah. So lovely. Thank you, Chena.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that June wants to come on, but I will share their words. Yeah, not a question. Just wow. Fuck yes. Thank you. Multiple fire hearts. Multiple fire hearts. As a recovering piano quitter, also thanks for being how you were with kids. What a huge gift.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
recovering piano quitter, I get it.
Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's major. I know, when you were talking about that, you were like, so many like, we just do this thing, and it's curious that it's
Yeah.
piano lessons and ballet.
It is
That's another thing.
curious that it's piano lessons and ballet, dance and music, just whack-a-mole with their souls. Bam, bam, bam.
Why? And that it is about rigor, and it really just feels like, an affirmation of this construct, rather than an invitation to creativity or expression. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily an invitation to creativity or expression. So,
No.
yeah, I don't know that there are any other questions, and so maybe we'll come to a close. I'll actually just
Yeah.
say that in case anybody is here, I encourage you to come on the chat and, share a question. I'll give a couple of announcements before, just while we're waiting to see if there's any more questions. If you enjoyed this conversation, I host, I have a I have a community called Communitas, and it's primarily, a chant and, visioning community. We've made some changes. It also includes what it was before, which is a practice journal, which is now quarterly. And this conversation, you can be here live with us in the room, and ask the featured artists some questions and be in the energy of it, because there's just something here when we come together in this direction. If you want to know more about Communitas, you can find out more on my website at innerlifecreations.com. And, that's pretty much it, because my other classes are going to, be announced more in the fall. So there'll be some other things. Spencer, is there anything is there any way that people can connect with you? It's a little tricky. You'd probably have to live in Bellingham. But
Yeah.
is there anything you want to share about how people can connect with you?
Yeah, you can if you go to The Joy of Piano on Instagram or Facebook, that goes to me. And I'm always open to like, I don't like it's kind of like what I in like being married is like this really, it's like a thing that happens inside between two people, and sometimes it's so strange, and you're just like, nobody could be having an experience this is weird, and it's the one I'm having. And then you like are honest with that about somebody, and they're like, oh yeah, it's like that for me too. It's this kind of a
Yeah.
thing where we have this inside experience that's so nuanced and specific, and it's so easy to feel totally isolated in that conversation. And I'm always available for that conversation.
I mean, you are
Yeah,
also like, you're in a, not to at you, which I'm totally going to do right now.
yeah,
So just prepare yourself. But Spencer's in a 2-year, apprenticeship training with me where, hopefully at some point he'll take
yeah,
on some clients doing alchemy work and
yeah,
sharing some of these, conversations and tools that we've been practicing together. And, whenever you're catching this, whether it's today or sometime in
yeah,
the future, I encourage you to reach out to Spencer
yeah.
and,
Because
work with him, because
there's
you're amazing. I'm just going to
thank
interrupt
you.
you, say that
Interrupt. Well, I was trying to interrupt you first, Meg. Because yeah, I have no idea how to deal with this entire conversation other than to look at all the ways it doesn't work and just try to like heal that, whatever that means. Heal
need
is
it.
this really ambiguous word, but just whatever it means to just look at the way it all is and not change it and not fix it. Just
Yeah.
fucking heal all the dark ways that it feels like, and then hope maybe that our relationship with it all is a little easier as that
Oh
happens.
man. I have things to say about that. I feel like a tenet of the work that I do in my practice is to sometimes just stand with people in the dark and
Yeah.
not light a lantern. Like,
Hmm.
I feel like part of the practice is just to be beside each other and to not necessarily shed anything on anything. And, yeah, vision, expectation of it being possible.
Yeah.
This is the work of practice. I feel like this is one of the true, right? So like, I just nerded out in my brain for like 2 seconds. That was really, it's like manna. I'm like, part of what's produced practice is, I think one of the pieces of manna that comes from practice is hope, is having vision with expectation of it being possible, rather than just hope of like, hope you're well, like at the end of an email or something. Like,
Yeah, I got nervous the moment I said the word hope.
I felt
Hope
that.
for
That's
a
why
lot
I'm
of
talking
things in
about
my
it.
life. Yeah.
Right. But like, I think when people can come together and share in the way that you just said of like, oh, I'm suffering alone and no one could possibly relate, but then actually being companioned, we have new vision of what's possible. And
Yeah.
there's
Just having a
an energy
thing.
that's produced. Yeah.
Just having. I've been seeing a lot of articles come up recently in like the Atlantic and other places about the isolation that our
Yep.
society is dealing with right now, especially post COVID, but with phones and social, just everything. And there's, I think it's easy to forget. It's easy for me to forget that how much change comes out of things just being in the light versus being in the darkness. We hold so much in the side of ourselves unseen, and just the moment that is witnessed,
Yeah.
it changes because
Yep.
because
Yep. And that's so an aim of these conversations. And honestly, the call to make them more available to the public, because we've been having these conversations. And I feel like for a time, the grace of what was said needed to be held close. And now it's time to come out. So thank you, Spencer, so
yeah,
kindly for sharing your wisdom and your stories of
thank you.
experience. Thank you
Thanks
all
for
who
the
are here live. And I see that a couple people are on YouTube as well. And it's just such a pleasure to go in this direction together. And I'm so honored that you're willing to share this time and to practice. We'll catch
whatever that
you
means.
next, whatever that means, whenever that, in whatever space you're in,
Yeah.
practice. It becomes such a generous possibility, just to go in that direction.
Yeah.
So the next practice live is on February 21st, and I want to see who it is. I know generally who's up, but I can't quite remember exactly who it is. It's Olive. So next month, we're going to talk with Olive Theodore about the Fool archetype and happenstantial magic, tumbling and fumbling our way into life
Happenstance.
and into practice. Yes. So thank you all for being here. Such a pleasure. And we'll catch you next month. And honestly, this might be a thing that I do more often, because these conversations are so generative. So I may
Pretty
share
juicy.
some more about my own practice. And if you want to see something, let me know, because I just want to be in it with some others who want to be in it too. Until again, friends, thank you.